here. As introduced, I'm Raido Puust, and I'm happy to present collaborative work which is coming on the EC3 Modeling and Standards Committee. And it's about adoption of BIM-related international standards across Europe. So, a bit of overview, first introduction. I also talk a bit about research background and gap, then what methodology we used, presenting also some preliminary results and conclusions. But first of all, I would like to introduce once again Modeling and Standards team who has been involved specifically in this article. And I'm not the first author, but hopefully can answer the questions at the end as well. So, what's the background of this research? First of all, we all know that standards are developed at multiple levels, like company, associations, but also international. And also standards are complemented with guidelines, templates, best practices. Now, the problem is that it's not clear if and how those standards reach relevant end users. And this research aims to investigate the acceptance and usage of international BIM regulating standards across Europe. So we have selected mainly those BIM standards that are published by Committee of Standardization, CEN, DC 442. And when it comes to BIM implementation, then we use BIM concepts which are defined in the standards, and we clearly focus on modeling and exchange of information this time. Now, when we look back and trying to see some previous research, then there are analyses of standards, of course. But what we have concluded during this research was that technical implementation is not always considered. It's not reaching all end users, or not covering all phases, domains, or not focusing on people or processes, mostly programs. And there is also no clear measurement of BIM capability. And of course, multiple levels of investigations like macro, organization. So what's a question we asked from ourselves and for this research was that what is the relation between adoption of standards and implementation of standardized concepts? Now, a bit how we did it. So, overview about our methodology. Firstly, we started with literature review, searching key terms like BIM adoption, BIM implementation. After selecting key papers, we developed our own questionnaire. And based on this questionnaire, we then asked from people from several locations, including social media. We got but 52, I don't know, 51 is in here, 52 responses. And before I just quickly also explain the data analysis, we can see that most of people who answered to this questionnaire were either working in different roles, like for example being a BIM manager, but also maybe project manager. So we can see that from the left lower corner that BIM management and multiple roles fills most of the answers. And also conclusion in here about the first and the second part, but if we focus on data analysis, which is last part in this slide, we simply used Excel to do that. I'm also already mentioning that we were taking focus on to in ISO 19650, because this was a key standards that was mentioned by people who were answering this questionnaire. but I will show also other responses in a minute. Now, each question was then summarized. We did some comparatory analysis. For example, answers from the same users were compared to identify specific patterns. Also, if multiple answers were given, then we use logical operations to identify similarities. So that's a background how we did it. And let's have some look to our results. So first of all, some general overview. We can see that large and medium companies, it's the top right corner, large and medium companies were the most answers, about 60%. Then also we can see that if we asked how many years has the company existed, so remember we were asking which kind of BIM standards you are using. So we can also see that we have 20% that they have been in business 0 to 5 years. And also when we asked when was the first project created with BIM tools, then we can see that red and yellow part, so it's the lower part graph, yes. So we can see that about 60% of answers are up to 10 years. So we see that definitely users do use BIM, but now the question is how much they use or define BIM standards every day. We also see that we got answers from 20 different European countries. Remember, we got 52 answers, so of course this is somewhat a limitation, but I will focus on limitations a bit later. Now, some more results, like company profile. We asked what kind of processes, procedures are in place. So we can see that company-specific standards and best practices are mostly answered. So 60% and 67%, blue lines, yes. And international standards also mentioned by 40%. But also we can see that 15% of answers were saying that processes and procedures are not standardized at all. Now, in here you can see now on x-axis you can see different EN standards, yes? And you can see how many were saying that they are using it. We see that in the middle part we see in ISO 19650 series, and those were mostly used or mostly answered, about 60%, yeah. And that's the reason why our continued research was focusing on to those. Also, what about the use of templates, procedures? Just a couple of examples also from this graph, like less commonly were used information delivery manual, risk register, but information standard and information delivery plans more frequently. And in terms of shared repository, which is quite hot topic today, yes, we see that about 10% are not using it at all, meaning that the communication is mainly by email, for example. But also we can see more positive side that 75% they use some specific tool, and then more generic ones 65, or we can of course conclude by that both systems are in use. So what are the conclusions? So we find out that the use of standards related to BIM concepts does not necessarily implies implementation of BIM implies implementation of same BIM concepts. Also, stakeholders have a diverse interest in standards, depending on the domain, country, or implementation of specific BIM concepts. And standards really need to be diffused through different channels to reach the end user, such as by introducing specific mandates. Is it the national level, by client, investor, or guidelines? Then we can kind of hope that standards will be more used. And finally, some limitations, future work. Of course, once again, we can't conclude too much because we don't have too many respondents. Yes, remember 20 countries, 52 answers. But we can also conclude that if this answer does represent some average company in that country at national level or regulation level, then we can kind of trust that information at country level as well. But still, of course, we can make it much wider, and that's our plan also for future. So we can't maybe provide detailed overview at this time moment. Also future work, validate results with wider audience, but also we have planned, we have done already some interviews which will be further published in later publications. So by that, thank you.
Thanks, Raido, very much. We have time for a couple of questions, response. Thank you, Raido. Yes, please.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. Do you know from the 52 answers you got, if it's 52 different companies, or if they might overlap with companies operating in multiple countries and you might go
Multiple countries, yes, because we have only 20 countries, so yeah. Multiple amounts.
Like it's 52 different companies, or could it be that they have one company operating?
Oh, operating, no, they are different ones. At least to my best knowledge right now, it's, yeah. Good question, yes.
Raido,